David, the greatest king in the history of Israel, was not anyone's first choice, but he was God's choice. Did you know that David, the one who later became the hero who defeated Goliath, was not born in a magnificent palace but in a forgotten field? When the prophet Samuel came to anoint the next ruler, even David's father didn't think to invite him. And when Israel needed a warrior, they didn't look at the boy with a sling. However, when God sought a leader, he didn't choose a man sitting on a throne, but a shepherd tending his flock. This is the story of a boy who went from being unknown to a giant slayer, from a fugitive to a king, from a man after God's own heart to a leader whose greatest enemy was not a Philistine warrior, but his own failures. David's story is one of faith, betrayal, war, love, power, and redemption. And if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or unqualified, stay with me, because David's journey is proof that God calls the unexpected. We've added timestamps to the description so you can easily jump to the most important parts of this story. And if this story gives you a new perspective, don't hesitate to share it with someone who needs to hear it. We've also converted our most popular videos into ebooks. Check the link in the description if you'd like to read this story in ebook format. Let us know if you like this idea in the comments. Now, let's go back to where it all began for David. Before the throne, before the great battles, before history knew his name, let's meet David, the king no one saw coming. David's story didn't begin with royal music or a grand prophecy about his greatness. It started in a place no one expected, the peaceful fields outside Bethlehem, where sheep grazed under the wide open sky. David was the youngest of 8 brothers, the one who was never considered when people spoke of Israel's future. Everyone spoke of warriors, kings, and leaders. David, the youngest child, was the one sent to tend the sheep while his brothers handled the real matters. But God had always been watching David. One day, the great prophet Samuel arrived in Bethlehem with a mission directly from God, to anoint the next king of Israel. The people of the town were puzzled when they heard of Samuel's arrival. They couldn't understand why he had come. Was it a warning or a judgment? After all, Samuel wasn't a man who came for trivial matters. However, David's father, Jesse, had no idea that this visit would change the destiny of the entire nation. Samuel commanded Jesse to bring his sons forward, for one of them was destined to be king. First came Eliab, tall, strong, and commanding. If there was ever a kingly figure, it was Eliab. Even Samuel thought so. But just as he was about to speak, God's voice stopped him. Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. 1 Samuel 16 verse 7. One by one, Jesse's sons passed before Samuel, 7 sons, and 7 times they were rejected. The room grew silent, and people began to wonder if God had made a mistake. Samuel asked Jesse, "Are these all your sons?" Jesse hesitated and answered, "There is still the youngest, but he is tending the sheep." David wasn't even invited to the important ceremony. Think about that for a moment. David's own father didn't think he was worthy to stand among his brothers. No one saw David's potential, no one considered him as an option. But God did. Samuel commanded that David be brought immediately. No one would sit until he arrived. And when David finally entered the house, covered in dust and dirt, just a young boy with no title, no armor, no reputation, the voice of God thundered in Samuel's heart, "Rise and anoint him. He is the one." David, the forgotten shepherd, was the future king of Israel. He was not the strongest, not trained in battle, nor did he have political connections, but he had something that no one else had, a heart that longed for God. Before Samuel arrived, David was out in the fields, learning how to lead. When a lion came to attack the flock, David didn't run, he fought. When a bear came to steal from the flock, he risked his life to protect them. No one saw, no one recorded it, but David was already a king in the training that God required. God didn't send David straight to the throne. He sent him back to the fields. Think about it, the young boy who had just been anointed as the next king of Israel had to return to tending sheep, no crown, no royal robes, just the same old life he had before. Why? Because glory is not built in palaces, it's forged in the unseen moments. David spent his days playing the harp, writing psalms, and protecting his flock. He talked to God when no one was around and trusted God in the silence. This is where many people give up. What would you do when God calls you to something greater but then sends you back to where you were before? David could have complained, but he didn't. David could have doubted, could have walked away, but instead, he did what he had always done, he remained faithful. And without even realizing it, in the moments when no one saw, he was being prepared. His battles with wild animals trained him to face giants. His long nights in the wilderness taught him to lead with courage. His deep prayers and psalms shaped him into a king who would worship God. God was molding him in the unseen places, and soon the world would see what God had always known: the forgotten shepherd boy was the king chosen by God. Have we ever felt overlooked like David? We watch others be chosen while we are left behind. We see others step into their calling while we quietly wait. But God sees what no one else sees. Maybe you are in a season of preparation. Maybe you are fighting battles no one notices. Maybe you're wondering if you'll ever step into the destiny God promised. David's story is proof that God doesn't forget his anointed. If he called you, he will raise you up at the right time. The world may overlook you, but God will never overlook you. And then, the shepherd boy would face a giant that no warrior dared to challenge. Do you have the faith to face Goliath? Let's step into one of the greatest moments in history, David versus Goliath, the battle that changed everything. For 40 days, the battlefield was silent. A giant figure from the enemy's camp stepped forward and challenged, his voice booming, "Why do you even bother lining up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man to fight me. If he kills me, we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be ours." No one moved. No one spoke. The armies of Israel, God's chosen people, stood frozen in fear, and no one was more terrified than King Saul himself. The mighty warrior king that Israel had begged for, the man who stood head and shoulders above everyone else, should have been the first to step up. But Saul knew this battle was unwinnable because Goliath wasn't just any warrior. He was a monster, 9 feet tall, with armor like iron plating, and a spear heavier than a grown man. Goliath was a walking fortress, an executioner in human form. Every morning, he marched onto the battlefield, his voice thundering like a war drum. Every day, Israel's warriors shrank back in terror. Saul's mighty men, men who had fought in wars before, trembled like children. And worst of all, Goliath mocked God, "Your God is weak, your armies are nothing. Bring me a real fight." And no one stepped forward. Until one day, the shepherd boy, David, arrived. David wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't a soldier. He had no armor, no sword, no rank. He was just delivering food to his brothers, running an errand for his father. But when he heard Goliath's challenge, something inside him burned with rage. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? 1 Samuel 17 verse 26. The soldiers scoffed at him, "Have you seen him? He will crush you." His own brothers sneered at him, "Go back to your sheep, David. This is war, not a game." But David saw something no one else did. They saw a giant too big to fight. David saw a giant too big to miss. Saul, the king, tried to stop David. News quickly spread through the camp, "There's a boy who says he'll fight Goliath." Saul laughed when he saw him, "You're just a boy, and he's been a warrior since his youth." But David's eyes burned with fire. "I've fought lions, I've fought bears when they came to steal my sheep. The Lord who delivered me from them will deliver me from this Philistine." David wasn't boasting. He wasn't bluffing. He had spent his whole life trusting God in private. Now God was about to make his faith public. Saul tried to arm David with royal armor, but it was too heavy and the sword too big. David took it off. "I don't need these," he said. "I don't need man's protection, I only need God's." And so, David stepped onto the battlefield, with nothing but a sling, a few stones, and unwavering faith. When Goliath saw David, he laughed. "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" he roared. But David didn't flinch. He stood firm and said, "You come against me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands." The battlefield fell silent. Then Goliath charged, his massive footsteps shaking the ground, his spear raised to kill. But David ran toward him, not away, not hesitating, straight toward the giant. With one practiced motion, he reached into his pouch, pulled out a stone, and let it fly. Whizzing through the air, the rock struck Goliath's forehead. The giant staggered, and the mighty warrior, the undefeatable champion, fell face down, dead. One stone. One moment. One boy's faith. And everything changed. The Philistine army stood in silence, while the Israelite army erupted in cheers. Their fear turned into strength as they charged forward, chasing the Philistines back to their cities. One battle had changed the future of Israel. A young boy, with courage, had brought down the empire of their enemy. And that is the power of faith. David's story is not just history, but a blueprint for every battle we face. We all have our own giants: fear, doubt, failure, sin. Like Israel, sometimes we stand frozen, thinking this is something we cannot overcome. But David's story reminds us that with God, nothing is impossible. David didn't win because he was the strongest, not because he was the most trained. He won because he trusted. And God, who guided his stone, will guide yours as well. What Goliath are you facing today? If God was faithful to David, he will be faithful to you. When all eyes turned to someone else, a young warrior, a shepherd boy with no royal blood but with a heart that God had chosen, Saul's joyful smile turned into a gaze filled with doubt. In that moment, his joy became suspicion, and his pride turned to poison. And it was in that very moment that King Saul made a decision that would define the rest of his life: David must die. Just days before, David had been an unknown shepherd, now he had become the most famous person in Israel. After killing Goliath, Saul brought David into the palace, rewarding him with riches, fame, and a commanding position in the army. And David fought brilliantly, winning every battle he participated in and completing every mission given to him with excellence. Wherever David went, God was with him, and the people saw it. They admired him and sang his name through the streets. With each victory, Saul became smaller and David grew greater. At first, Saul tried to ignore it. He tried to convince himself that David was just a soldier, just another man in his kingdom. But the people's praise continued. Saul has slain thousands, but David his tens of thousands. And confusion began to arise. What else could he lose? Only the throne. And the moment that should have made Saul a mentor, turned him into a murderer. One evening, as David played the harp in the palace, the sweet sound filled the halls. The music should have soothed Saul's spirit, but instead, his anger boiled over. Without a word, Saul grabbed a spear from beside his throne. David, still playing the harp, unaware of the danger approaching, suddenly felt the spear fly towards him, aimed straight at his heart. The spear lodged deep in the wall. David leaped to his feet, his heart racing, staring at the weapon that nearly took his life. He turned to see Saul, his eyes burning with hatred. "I will pin him to the wall," the king growled. David didn't hesitate, he ran. If Saul couldn't kill David with his own hands, he decided to let the Philistines do it. He sent David on the most dangerous missions, hoping he would never return. But David kept coming back victorious, unscathed, and even more praised by the people. In his desperation, Saul came up with another plan: marry my daughter. It seemed like an honor, but it was a trap. To marry her, David had to kill 100 Philistines, an almost impossible task. But David killed 200. And now, he was not only a warrior but also the king's son-in-law. This didn't bring peace to Saul, instead, it made him even more frantic. David was not just a threat, he was his replacement. In the kingdom, there was only one person who didn't see David as a rival: Jonathan, Saul's own son. By all logic, Jonathan should have been David's enemy. He was the heir to the throne, while David was the rising star. But instead of resenting David, Jonathan loved him like a brother. He saw God's hand upon David's life. When Saul commanded his son to kill David, Jonathan risked everything to warn him, "Run, David, my father will never stop hunting you." And so, David, the hero, the commander, the king's son-in-law, became a fugitive. For many years, David lived like an outlaw, hiding in caves, moving from city to city, evading every trap Saul set for him. The once great warrior now slept under the stars, eating whatever he could find, surrounded by outcasts and criminals. There were times when David questioned, "God, you anointed me, but now I am hunted like an animal. Where are you?" But even in the darkest places, God never abandoned David. David attracted a loyal band of warriors, men who would fight for him no matter what. He had no palace, no crown, no army, but God was with him. And then came the test. One night, Saul, with 3,000 men, came hunting David. Exhausted, the king entered a cave to rest, unaware that David was already inside. This was it. David's men whispered, "God has delivered your enemy into your hands, kill him now." David crept forward, dagger in hand. Saul was helpless, unarmed, exposed. With one strike, David could end it all, take the throne, take his revenge, fulfill the prophecy. But instead of killing Saul, David simply cut off a piece of Saul's robe. When Saul left the cave, David held it up and shouted, "My lord, the king, I could have killed you, but I will not touch the Lord's anointed." Saul broke down in tears, "You are more righteous than I am." But his jealousy never faded, and the hunt continued. David remained a king without a kingdom. While Saul spiraled deeper into madness, the Philistines grew stronger, and a king who had once hunted David was now the one being hunted. When the battle came, the Philistines overran Israel's army. Jonathan, David's closest friend, was killed on the battlefield. And amidst the dark of war, abandoned by God, Saul fell on his own sword. The mighty king of Israel was dead. Far from the battlefield, David received the news. He didn't celebrate. He wept. "How the mighty have fallen," David cried, for even though Saul had tried to kill him for years, David never lost his respect for him. And now, the man who had pursued him for his entire life was gone. David, once a fugitive, was about to take the throne. David stood in the shadows, breathing steadily, his hand gripping the hilt of his dagger. This was the moment. Saul, the man who had hunted him like an animal, who had forced him into exile, who had taken everything from him, was lying just a few steps away, unprotected, unaware. David's soldiers whispered in his ear, "This is your chance. God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Strike him down." After years of running, suffering, now, with one strike, David could end it all, seize the throne, take revenge, and fulfill the prophecy. But instead of doing that, David chose mercy, and that decision changed everything. Saul had become obsessed. Every day, he thought about David, no longer as a loyal warrior, not as his son-in-law, not as a friend, but as a threat. His kingdom was slipping away from his grasp, and he knew it. So, he gathered 3,000 elite soldiers and scoured the land, hunting David like a wild beast. One afternoon, the king rode through the dry hills of Ziph, sweat dripping from his brow. The search had been long, so when he saw a cave, he decided to rest there, unaware that David was inside. David and his men held their breath. Saul was completely alone. This was not a battlefield. There were no armies between them. David could strike, and by nightfall, he could become king. David's soldiers whispered, "God has delivered him into your hands. This is the moment you've been waiting for." David silently moved forward. One step, then another. He raised the dagger, but instead of stabbing Saul, he simply cut a piece of Saul's robe. Saul left the cave unaware. As he stepped into the light, David called out, "My lord, the king, I could have killed you, but I will not touch the one whom God has anointed." The wind blew through the canyon, silent. The soldiers stood there, waiting. And for the first time in many years, Saul's anger broke. His shoulders trembled, tears streamed down his face. "You are more righteous than I," he said. "You have repaid me with good, while I have repaid you with evil." In that moment, it seemed like the war between them was over, but Saul's jealousy never faded, and the hunt continued. Days passed, and David still had to run, sleep in caves, move from place to place, never staying long. Then another opportunity arose. Saul and his army camped in the wilderness of Ziph. Their tent stretched under the moonlit sky. That night, David and his warriors silently entered the camp, past the first sentries, past the second, and in the center of the camp, Saul was asleep. Saul's spear, the very spear he had thrown at David in the palace, was planted in the ground beside him. Once again, God had delivered Saul into David's hands. Abishai, David's bravest warrior, leaned close. "Let me strike him with his own spear," he whispered. "One blow, and it will all be over." David looked down at his enemy, the king who had tried to kill him, the king who had forced him into exile, the king who had stolen years of his life. Justice would be so easy, but David shook his head. "Do not touch the one whom God has anointed." Instead, David took Saul's spear and water jug, as a sign, a symbol. And then, without a sound, he left. When the sun rose, David stood on a distant hill, calling out to Saul's army. Abner, he shouted to Saul's commander, "You have failed your king. Where is his spear?" Saul woke, rubbed his eyes, and saw David, holding his spear. Once again, David had spared Saul's life. Once again, David had proven himself the better man. Saul's voice broke as he called out, "I have sinned. Return to me, my son David, I will no longer seek to harm you." But David knew the truth. Saul could not be trusted. He turned his back and walked away, not as a servant, not as an outlaw, but as a man chosen by God. Twice, David had the perfect opportunity. Twice, he could have ended Saul's life, but David understood something Saul never did: power is not something you take. It is something God gives. David refused to seize the throne hastily. Instead, he waited for God's timing. Unlike Saul, who clung to his throne in fear, David trusted that when the time came, God would place him on the throne. And that is why David was called a man after God's own heart. The story of Saul and David is a tale of two kings, one chosen by the people, the other chosen by God. One insecure, fearful of losing power, while the other chose to trust in God and wait for his timing. Power. One person seeks to seize it and loses everything. The other, steadfast, ready to trust in God's timing. One takes power for himself and loses it all. The other waits for God's time, and the kingdom is given to him by God's authority. David passed the test of power. He proved that he would not become another Saul, and soon the throne that Saul fought so hard to keep would be given to David, by God's will. But before that day came, Saul had one final battle to fight. The battlefield was soaked in blood. Arrows flew like a swarm of locusts, cutting through the air with terrifying precision. The Israelite army was in full retreat, their shields shattered, their swords broken. On the slopes of Mount Gilboa, King Saul stood, his face pale, his armor dented, and his spirit completely crushed. The mighty king of Israel was about to fall. For many years, Saul had clung to the throne in confusion, chasing shadows, pursuing David, chasing a future he could not hold on to. But the true enemy, the Philistines, had continued to grow stronger. They had reorganized, become more powerful, more determined. And now, as Saul faced them on Mount Gilboa, he realized something devastating: God was no longer with him. He had sought guidance, but God was silent. He had turned to the priests, but they had no answers. In sheer desperation, Saul had consulted a witch, a forbidden act, and this sealed his fate. And now, as the chariots of the Philistines roared across the battlefield, Saul knew that this was the end. The battle raged on with unstoppable fury. Spears pierced flesh, swords clashed, and one by one, Saul's sons fell. First Abinadab, then Meshua, and finally Jonathan. Jonathan, the prince who had risked everything to protect David, the one who had single-handedly defeated a whole Philistine garrison with nothing but his faith and his sword, now lay motionless in the earth, his blood soaking into the ground of Israel. Saul staggered back, horrified. His kingdom was lost, his lineage was destroyed, his sons were gone. And then, a Philistine arrow struck him with a sickening thud, piercing his armor and cutting into his flesh. The pain shot through him like fire, and Saul fell to his knees. He gasped, trying to rise, but his strength was gone. The Philistine archers closed in. If they caught him alive, they would torture him, mock him, and humiliate him, parading him through their cities as a broken king. Saul could not bear the thought. With trembling hands, he turned to his armor-bearer and whispered, draw your sword and kill me before these uncircumcised men come and abuse me." But the young soldier refused. He could not raise his weapon against the anointed king of Israel. Saul had no choice. With his last breath, he fell on his own sword. And just like that, the first king of Israel was no more. Far away, David was still in the wilderness of Ziklag, unaware that the throne he had been promised for so long was now vacant. Then, a messenger appeared, his clothes torn, his face filled with urgency. "Saul is dead," the messenger gasped. "And so is Jonathan." David's heart stopped. Saul, his enemy, and Jonathan, his best friend, both gone. There was a moment of silence, then David wept. Not out of relief, not out of victory, but out of grief. This was not how he had imagined it. He had run from Saul for so many years, hunted like an animal, but now, with Saul dead, David felt no joy, only sorrow. He tore his clothes, fasted, and then wrote a lament. "How the mighty have fallen! Saul and Jonathan, your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women." This was a song of mourning, not a victory cry, for David did not rejoice in the death of his enemy, he mourned. David stood in the shadows, breathing steadily, his hand firmly gripping the hilt of his dagger. This was his moment. Saul, the man who had relentlessly hunted him, who had forced him into exile, who had taken everything from him, was now lying just a few steps away, vulnerable, unprotected, unaware. David's soldiers whispered, "This is your chance. God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Strike him down." After years of running, suffering, now, with a single strike, David could end it all, seize the throne, take revenge, and fulfill the prophecy. But instead of doing so, David chose mercy, and that decision changed everything. Saul had become obsessed. Each day, he thought about David, no longer seeing him as a loyal warrior, not as his son-in-law, not as a friend, but as a threat. His kingdom was slipping away, and he knew it. So, he gathered 3,000 elite soldiers and scoured the land, hunting David like a wild beast. One afternoon, the king, exhausted from the search, rode through the barren hills of Ziph, sweat dripping down his face. When he saw a cave, he decided to rest there, unaware that David was inside. David and his men held their breath. Saul was completely alone. This wasn't a battlefield, no armies stood between them. David could strike, and by nightfall, he could become king. David's men whispered, "God has delivered him into your hands, this is the moment you've been waiting for." David silently moved forward. One step, then another. He raised the dagger, but instead of striking Saul, he simply cut a piece of Saul's robe. Saul left the cave unaware. As he stepped into the light, David called out, "My lord, the king, I could have killed you, but I will not touch the one whom God has anointed." The wind blew through the canyon, silent. The soldiers stood still, waiting. And for the first time in many years, Saul's anger broke. His shoulders trembled, tears flowed down his face. "You are more righteous than I," he said. "You have repaid me with good, while I have repaid you with evil." In that moment, it seemed like the conflict between them was over, but Saul's jealousy never ceased, and the hunt continued. Days passed, and David still had to run, sleep in caves, move from place to place, never staying too long. Then another opportunity arose. Saul and his army camped in the wilderness of Ziph. Their tents stretched beneath the moonlit sky. That night, David and his warriors quietly entered the camp, past the first sentries, past the second, and in the middle of the camp, Saul was asleep. Saul's spear, the very one he had thrown at David in the palace, was planted in the ground beside him. Once again, God had delivered Saul into David's hands. Abishai, David's bravest warrior, leaned close. "Let me strike him with his own spear," he whispered. "One blow, and it will all be over." David looked down at his enemy, the king who had tried to kill him, the king who had forced him into exile, the king who had taken years of his life. Justice would be so easy, but David shook his head. "Do not touch the one whom God has anointed." Instead, David took Saul's spear and water jug, as a sign, a symbol. Then, without a sound, he left. When the sun rose, David stood on a distant hill, calling out to Saul's army. "Abner," he called to Saul's commander, "you have failed your king. Where is his spear?" Saul woke, rubbed his eyes, and then saw David, holding his spear. Once again, David had spared Saul's life. Once again, David had proven himself the better man. Saul's voice broke as he called out, "I have sinned. Return to me, my son David, I will no longer seek to harm you." But David knew the truth. Saul could not be trusted. He turned his back and walked away, not as a servant, not as an outlaw, but as a man chosen by God. Twice, David had the perfect opportunity. Twice, he could have ended Saul's life, but David understood something Saul never did: power is not something you take. It is something God gives. David refused to seize the throne hastily. Instead, he waited for God's timing. Unlike Saul, who clung to the throne in fear, David trusted that when the time came, God would place him on the throne. And that is why David was called a man after God's own heart. The story of Saul and David is a tale of two kings, one chosen by the people, the other chosen by God. One insecure, fearful of losing power, while the other chose to trust in God and wait for his timing. At that time, Jerusalem was still under the control of the Jebusites, a Canaanite people who had held the city for generations. They were so confident in their impregnable walls that when David and his army arrived, they mocked him, saying, "Even the blind and the lame could keep you out." But David laughed because he knew something they didn't: his army had found a way into the city through a water tunnel. David's warriors successfully infiltrated the city, opened the gates from within, and in a swift victory, Jerusalem fell into David's hands. He named the city, City of David, and declared it to be the new capital of Israel. This wasn't just a political move, it had a spiritual significance. Jerusalem was not only a stronghold but would become the dwelling place of God. But before that could happen, something sacred had to return. For many years, the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence, had been exiled. It had been captured by the Philistines, moved from place to place, and finally left in the house of Abinadab, gathering dust. David knew that if Israel was truly to be united, they needed more than just a king, they needed God's presence at the heart of the nation. So, David ordered that the Ark of the Covenant be brought to Jerusalem. This wasn't just a ceremonial event, it was a moment that would shape his entire reign. It was a day of celebration, for the Ark, the very throne of God, was coming home. David and his soldiers danced before the Ark, celebrating with music, trumpets, and sacrifices. The people sang, the nation rejoiced, and David danced like someone with no worries, like someone who had once been hunted, imprisoned, and now stood firm as the king of a united people. But not everyone was impressed. As David danced, his wife, Michal, Saul's daughter, watched from the palace window, her face filled with contempt. To her, David seemed foolish, a king acting like a commoner, humiliating himself in front of the servants. When David returned home, she mocked him. The king of Israel today has distinguished himself, dancing like a fool, exposing himself before the servants. But David didn't care. "I will become even more undignified than this," he replied, "I will celebrate before the Lord." And from that day forward, Michal had no children, a sign that Saul's line would not continue through her. With the kingdom united, Jerusalem conquered, and the Ark of God placed in the capital, Israel entered its golden age. For the first time in history, Israel was no longer at war with itself. David expanded the borders, brought justice to the people, and built an empire that would be remembered for generations. The city of David became the heart of Israel, the Ark of the Covenant returned, and the nation lived in peace. David, the forgotten shepherd boy, had become the greatest king Israel had ever known. But peace never lasts forever. For David's greatest test was not with Goliath, not with Saul, not with the Philistines. His greatest challenge would be with himself, and the sins he would commit would shake the kingdom to its core. For much of Israel's history, the nation had always been on the defensive. The Canaanites, the Philistines, the Moabites, and the Ammonites had made Israel fight to survive through many generations. Saul had led many battles, but his reign ended in disaster when the Philistines shattered his army, and even his own soldiers turned against him. But when David took the throne, everything changed. For the first time in history, Israel was not just fighting to survive, it was expanding its borders. David knew that if Israel's borders were not expanded, the surrounding nations would see it as weak. Instead of waiting for war to come to him, David brought war to them. With the strength of Israel's army behind him, he launched a series of military campaigns to expand Israel's borders, taking it farther than ever before. The Philistines were Israel's greatest threat, from the days of Samson to the reign of Saul. They had raided cities, enslaved people, and crushed Israel's armies. Even after David had killed Goliath, the Philistines did not vanish. But David was not like Saul. He would not allow his people to live in fear. He led his army, not just to defend, but to crush the Philistine strongholds once and for all. One by one, their cities fell: Gath, Ekron, Ashdod. The once mighty Philistine empire was destroyed under David's onslaught, never to rise again. For the first time in generations, Israel was no longer oppressed. The Philistines, Israel's greatest enemy, had been subdued. And David was just getting started. David turned his attention to Moab. At first, the Moabites had shown him kindness, offering protection to his family when he fled from Saul. But perhaps they had become too comfortable in their power. Perhaps they had broken the alliance with David, or perhaps David saw their strength as a future threat. When David's army marched into Moab, he did something that shocked the ancient world. The Moabite warriors were lined up before him, and he did something no one expected. He measured them, 2/3 of them were executed, and the remaining third were made servants of Israel. This was a warning to every other nation: defy David, and your kingdom will fall. David didn't just look to the west. He also looked to the north, where the Arameans in Damascus posed a formidable threat. But David's army defeated them and forced them to pay tribute to Israel. He also looked to the south, where Israel's longtime enemies were defeated, and their territories placed under Israel's control. Everywhere David went, he achieved victory, and with each victory, Israel's influence grew. No longer a small nation in the hills, Israel had become a superpower, a nation respected and feared across the region. But how did David win all of these battles? The answer lies in David's army. David wasn't just an exceptional warrior, he also had mighty warriors by his side. A group of elite fighters known as David's mighty men. They weren't just ordinary soldiers. They were great warriors, each with stories of unimaginable victories and battles that seemed impossible to win. Joshua Bashab killed 800 men in a single battle with his spear. Eleazar fought so long his hand froze to his sword, and he alone faced the enemy when Israel's army fled. Shammah stood his ground alone in a field against the Philistines when everyone else ran. And then there was Benaiah, who killed a lion in a pit on a snowy day and defeated an Egyptian warrior twice his size. These were the elite fighters of David, men who helped make Israel's army unstoppable. But David's victories weren't just the result of military strength. His victories were not merely the outcome of great warriors, they were the result of something greater. God was always with him. The Bible repeatedly mentions this, and the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. Yes, David was a brilliant strategist, he had mighty warriors, and he trained harder than any king before him. But his true strength came from his trust in God. Before every battle, David prayed. Before every conquest, he sought God's guidance. And because he walked in obedience, God handed his enemies over to him. That's why David never failed, because his strength didn't come from himself, but from God. At the height of David's reign, Israel's borders expanded like never before. The kingdom was secure, Israel's enemies were defeated, the land was prosperous, and the people lived in peace. David accomplished what no king before him had, he transformed a divided nation into a powerful empire. But victory always comes with a price. David had spent many years in war. He had conquered everything in front of him, but his greatest enemy wasn't on the battlefield. The greatest battle was yet to come, and it wouldn't be fought with a sword, but with his own heart. The sword had never caused David to fail. He had crushed armies, conquered cities, and stood firm before the might of entire nations. But now, for the first time, David faced an enemy he couldn't fight with steel, an enemy that didn't come from outside the kingdom, but from within his own heart. And this battle, David would lose. This is the moment when everything changes. This is the story of how Israel's greatest king fell, and it all began with a single glance. The battle David had to face was no longer one with external enemies but with himself. David's story turns a new page, not with weapons, but with the wrong decisions that would alter his life. Everything started with a single glance. On a spring evening, as David stood on the rooftop of his palace, he saw a woman bathing under the moonlight. The water ran down her smooth skin, the shimmering waves of water washed away the dust of a long day. She was beautiful, and David couldn't take his eyes off her. Though David already had hundreds of wives and thousands of concubines, though he had wealth and power, at this moment, none of that mattered. He had to have her. David inquired about her, and they replied, "She is Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Bathsheba was not just anyone's wife, she was the wife of one of David's most loyal warriors, a man who had fought alongside him, bled for him, and was now fighting on the battlefield while David remained in Jerusalem. David knew this was wrong. He knew what God had commanded, but power can cloud one's judgment. When you can have anything, it's easy to believe that the rules no longer apply to you. So, David ordered Bathsheba to come, and that night, he did what was wrong, taking what wasn't his. Weeks later, Bathsheba sent word that she was pregnant. David felt panic and fear. If the truth came out, his reputation would be ruined. The entire nation would see him as a betrayer, an adulterer. The anointed king of Israel, the man after God's own heart, had become a sinner. Like many powerful men who fall, David tried to cover up his sin. He ordered Uriah to be brought back from the battlefield, hoping that Uriah would go home and sleep with his wife, making people think the child was his. However, Uriah was a man of honor. He refused to go home, saying that how could he enjoy comfort while the other soldiers were still fighting. Instead of going home, Uriah slept outside the palace gate. David's plan failed, and he began to sink deeper into his sin, his heart darkening. When this plan failed, David decided to resort to a more drastic measure, to kill Uriah. David wrote a letter, ordering Uriah's execution, and sent it by the hand of Uriah himself. The letter commanded that Uriah be placed at the front lines of the fiercest battle, and then, when the army withdrew, Uriah would be left alone, to be killed. Joab, David's general, carried out the order. Uriah was placed in the most dangerous position, and when the army withdrew, Uriah was killed, as planned by David. When news of Uriah's death reached David, he breathed a sigh of relief. The problem was solved. He took Bathsheba as his wife, and for a time, he thought he had gotten away with it. But God had seen everything, and he would not remain silent. One day, the prophet Nathan came to David and told him a story. There were two men in a city, one rich with many sheep, and the other poor with only one lamb, which he loved like his own daughter. One day, the rich man had a guest, but instead of taking a sheep from his own flock, he took the poor man's only lamb and slaughtered it to prepare a meal for his guest. David's anger burned within him, and he said, "That man deserves to die." But Nathan turned to him, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "You are that man." In that moment, David was struck with the realization of his sin. He had taken the wife of a loyal man, killed an innocent man, and now he would face God's judgment. Nathan declared God's punishment, "The sword will never depart from your house." David repented, fell on his knees before God, and wept bitterly, but the consequences came. The child Bathsheba carried would not survive. David fasted and pleaded with God for mercy, but on the seventh day, the child died. David saw the cost of his wrong choices. Sin always has consequences. No matter how much power you have or how much you try to cover it up, God always sees. Yet, in the midst of God's judgment, there was still mercy. Bathsheba and David had another son, who would be named Solomon, the future king of Israel, who would build the temple of God. This is a reminder that even when we fall, even when we sink deep into sin, God can still redeem us. But the scars remain. David went through dark days, and his family would be torn apart. The kingdom he built would face great challenges. But the worst days of David were still ahead. David had defeated many enemies, ruled a mighty kingdom, but when he faced his own sin, the greatest battle came not from the battlefield but from within his own soul. All began when David stopped trusting in God's guidance and instead leaned on his own pride. At that moment, he trusted in the strength of his army, in numbers, and in his own power. Although counting soldiers was not a new practice, David's action was different. In the past, he had always relied on God to win every battle. But now, David wanted to know exactly how powerful his army was, how many men he could call to war, and how much control he really had. David did not do this to honor God, but to glorify himself. And as soon as he did it, David felt regret. He knew he had made a grave mistake. Joab, David's loyal general, immediately sensed the problem. "May the Lord increase the number of his people 100-fold, Joab protested, but David wouldn't listen. He ordered Joab to count all the fighting men in Israel, despite Joab's warning. So, Joab traveled across the land for 9 long months, recording the number of soldiers. When the report came back to David, it was a huge number, 1.3 million men, a mighty army. But inside, David felt the weight of his actions. At that moment, he realized he had sinned against God. The next morning, when the report was complete, the prophet Gad came to David with a message no king wants to hear. The Lord says, I give you 3 choices. Choose one of the 3 punishments: 3 years of famine, 3 months of being pursued by your enemies, or 3 days of plague. David, distressed, didn't know what to do. He fell on his face before the Lord, pleading, I am in deep distress, but let me fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but do not let me fall into human hands. David could not bear the thought of war. After so many years of fighting, he knew his enemies would show no mercy. Therefore, he chose the plague. And what happened next shook Israel to its core. The plague began with a soft breeze, and soon people started to fall. The plague spread throughout the land, and in every village, every home, the people were horrified as their loved ones collapsed. Priests fell in the temple, soldiers died in the barracks. David watched as 70,000 Israelites perished, and he painfully realized that it was his sin that caused it all. It was his pride, and the cost was too high. When the angel of the Lord stretched his hand toward Jerusalem, David could bear it no longer. He fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face, and begged the Lord, Lord, it is I who have sinned, I am the shepherd, but they are only sheep. Please punish me and my family, do not punish Israel. At that moment, the Lord stopped. The plague ceased, and the angel of the Lord stood still at the threshing floor of a man named Araunah. David, still in tears, approached Araunah and said, I must build an altar here, to offer a sacrifice to the Lord, so that this plague may not return. Araunah, astonished by all that had happened, was willing to give David the land and the sacrificial animals for free. Take my land, take my oxen, do all that you need, Araunah said. But David refused, saying, I will not offer to the Lord what costs me nothing. So, David used his own money to buy the land and the sacrificial animals. There, he built an altar, offered sacrifices, and sought God's forgiveness. From that moment, the plague stopped forever. And the greatest miracle happened right there, on Araunah's threshing floor, where David made the greatest sacrifice of his life. It was there that the kingdom of Israel received forgiveness and was delivered. But it was also a lesson about the cost of sin and true repentance. Right there, at the threshing floor of Araunah, where David made his sacrifice, would become a significant place in Israel's history. The place where God showed mercy would one day become the most important location in the history of this nation, Mount Moriah, where David's son Solomon would build the temple of the Lord. David had fought many battles, but his greatest battle was against his own pride. The census was not just about numbers, it was about faith. Would David rely on his own strength, or would he trust in the Lord, who had always fought for him? That question still remains for us today. Do we trust in our own resources? Do we measure success by money, power, or possessions? Or do we place our trust fully in the Lord? David learned this lesson the hard way, through loss, through suffering, through humility. In the end, the man after God's own heart returned to him, and God showed mercy, for no matter how much we fail, no matter how deep we fall into pride or make the worst mistakes of our lives, God's mercy is greater than all. David was no longer the mighty warrior he once was. His body, once strong enough to slay giants, now trembled with age. The hands that had held the sword in battle, that had strummed the harp in worship, now shook with weakness. The mighty king was slowly fading. And when he took his final breaths, David faced one last crucial decision: who would sit on the throne after him? Would his kingdom end in peace, or would his sons tear each other apart for the crown? David had promised that Solomon, the son of Bathsheba, would be the next ruler, but there was a problem. David had another son, Adonijah. Adonijah, like his fallen brother Absalom, was ambitious and power-hungry. He did not wait for David to decide but declared himself king while David was still alive. He gathered chariots, built a support force, including Joab, David's former general, held a royal feast, and proclaimed himself king. This betrayal could have destroyed the kingdom. But Adonijah did not know that someone was watching and would not remain silent. Bathsheba, the mother who had lost one son because of David's sin, would not let Solomon be lost. She rushed to David's bedside, knowing that if she did not act quickly, Solomon would be killed. "My lord," she whispered, kneeling beside her dying husband, "did you not swear that Solomon would be king? Why then is Adonijah declaring himself king while you are still alive?" Another figure stepped forward, the prophet Nathan. Nathan, who had once confronted David about his sin with Bathsheba, now came to protect the kingdom. "My king, Adonijah has taken your throne. If you do not act, Solomon and Bathsheba will be killed." David looked at them, his body frail, but his mind still sharp. He knew what had to be done. With his last remaining strength, David rose from his bed and declared, "As surely as the Lord lives, Solomon will be the next king." With these words, the fate of the kingdom was sealed. David called for Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah his trusted warrior, and ordered, "Take Solomon, place him on my mule, anoint him with oil, and declare him king over Israel." As Adonijah celebrated his false victory, the sound of trumpets echoed throughout the city, and the people shouted with joy, "Long live King Solomon!" When Adonijah heard the noise, his face went pale, and his betrayal was over before it even began. He rushed to the altar and begged Solomon for mercy. Solomon spared his life, but not forever. David could finally rest. He had fought, built a kingdom, and now he had chosen a successor. His final words to Solomon were, "Be strong, show yourself a man, walk in the ways of the Lord, and you will prosper. But remember that there are those who have wronged me, Joab and Shimei, do not let them die in peace." Though in his final breath, David still hadn't resolved everything, his words were a lesson in justice and mercy. With his last breath, David closed his eyes, and the mighty king, the shepherd, the man after God's own heart, passed away. Solomon ascended to the throne, and the kingdom continued. David's story is the story of anyone in history. He was a warrior, a poet, a king, and also a sinner. David won great battles but also made terrible mistakes. He was a man of blood and a man of worship. But through it all, God never abandoned him. David's reign wasn't about perfection, it was about mercy. That's why his throne will endure forever, because from his lineage, after many centuries, would come the King of Kings, Jesus Christ, and through him, David's dynasty would never end. David was not a perfect man. He lied, he killed, he took another man's wife, but God still called him a man after his own heart. What set David apart from other kings? It was his repentance. When Saul disobeyed God, he made excuses. But when David sinned, he repented and returned to God. That is what made him the greatest king Israel ever had. David was not just a warrior or a poet, he was the king who established Israel's golden age. Before David, Israel was a scattered nation, always at war. But under David, Israel became a united kingdom. He made Jerusalem the capital, the heart of the nation. David brought back the Ark of the Covenant, restoring the nation's focus on God. He expanded Israel's borders, taking it beyond territories that had never been conquered before. For the first time in history, Israel didn't just survive, it thrived. And all of it happened because David trusted in God more than in his own strength. David's influence wasn't just political but spiritual as well. More than half of the Psalms in the Bible were written by him. These words were not just songs, they were the cries of a man who walked with God through every season of life. David's Psalms are not just poetry, they are a record of a heart completely devoted to God. So, what lesson do we learn from David's life? God does not choose people based on outward appearance, status, or strength. He chooses those whose hearts are devoted to him. Repentance is more important than perfection. True leadership comes from humility, not power. David led with trust in God, not just military might. God's promises never fail. Even when everything seems to fall apart, his plan is still in motion. David's story did not end with his death, his influence lasted through the centuries, because from his lineage came the King of Kings, Jesus Christ, and through him, David's throne would never be empty. David was a king, a warrior, a poet, but most importantly, he was human. Through his failures and successes, we see God's mercy for those who seek him. David was not perfect, but God never gave up on him. David's story is proof to us that no failure is too great for God's grace to redeem.